She left me out of the will, gave everything to my brother, and expected me to keep paying. The day my mother told me she'd never loved me was etched into my memory like a scar. It wasn't a heated confession, nor a moment of cathartic truth. It was a quiet statement, delivered with the same detached tone she used when deciding what to have for dinner. It happened in the kitchen, a place once filled with warmth and the sweet aroma of pancake sundaes. Now it was cold, the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, the countertops cluttered with forgotten moments. I stood there, trying to reconcile the mother I had always tried to please with the stranger before me. But to understand how I got there, we need to go back to a different morning, one filled with light, laughter, and the scent of maple syrup. I was 6 years old, curled up on the couch with my favorite stuffed bunny, watching Dad flip pancakes like a magician with a spatula. "Princess Harper," he called, waving me over with a smile. "Come help your old man make breakfast magic." I laughed, leaping off the couch, unaware it would be the last time I'd ever see him smile. One moment, he was spinning pancakes in the air. The next, the spatula clattered to the floor as his hand clutched his chest. Mom screamed, and I froze. That Sunday morning dissolved into a blur of ambulance sirens and sterile hospital halls. Dad never came home, and from that moment on, life became an endless attempt to fill a void that only seemed to grow. Within months of Dad's passing, Mom met Ben, a kind-eyed man who seemed to carry the weight of his own losses. He became a steady presence, though never quite filling the role of father. When I was 8, Mom dropped another bombshell. "You're going to be a big sister." Brandon's arrival changed everything. Mom left her job to care for him full-time, pouring her energy into her new son. "These early years are crucial," she'd say, brushing aside any attention I craved. I learned to fend for myself, watching from the sidelines as Mom's world revolved around Brandon. "Harper," Ben said one evening, helping me with my homework, "sometimes people get so focused on one thing, they forget about the rest." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Even then, I knew that no amount of perfect grades or good behavior would make Mom look at me the way she did Brandon. As Brandon grew older, so did Mom's obsession with him. She hovered over his every move, wrapping him in a cocoon of overprotection. When Ben suggested signing Brandon up for a children's baseball team, hoping it would help him become more independent, Mom reacted as if he had proposed something absurdly dangerous. "No way," she snapped, her voice shrill. "Do you know how dangerous baseball can be? He could get hit by a ball or twist his ankle." I watched from the staircase, pretending to be engrossed in my homework, but every word sank into me like stones in water. Ben tried to reason with her, but Mom wouldn't budge. Instead, she signed Brandon up for art classes. He hated them and quit after 3 sessions, but of course, Mom blamed the teacher. Meanwhile, Ben started spending more time with me. He never missed a correct class, always cheering the loudest when I earned a new belt. For a while, his attention was enough to keep me afloat. But it didn't stop Mom from constantly making me clean up after Brandon. "Harper, be a sweetheart and tidy up Brandon's room," she'd say. It wasn't really a request. One day, Ben finally had enough. "She's not his maid, Diana," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "He needs to learn to pick up after himself." But Mom didn't listen. Instead, she resorted to her usual tactic, tears. "You love her more than your own son," she accused, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. Ben sighed, raising his hands in surrender, but I could see the weariness in his eyes. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how unfair it all felt. No matter how hard I tried, I was never enough. High school came and went in a blur. I worked hard, hoping that my achievements would earn Mom's approval. But each accomplishment was met with indifference, as though my efforts were nothing more than background noise to Brandon's life. On my graduation day, Ben stood in the crowd, clapping proudly, while Mom barely glanced up from her phone. She had brought Brandon's nanny along, just in case he needed something. My big moment was merely a minor inconvenience in his schedule. That evening, Ben called me into his study. The room smelled of leather and old books, a quiet sanctuary amidst the chaos of our home. "I've been saving," he said, placing a folder full of college brochures on the desk. "You can go anywhere you want, Harper. The sky's the limit." Before I could respond, Mom barged in, her face flushed with anger. "You can't be serious," she exclaimed. "That money should be saved for Brandon's future." Ben's face hardened. "This is non-negotiable, Diana. I've made my decision. I chose a college far enough away to start fresh, but close enough to visit occasionally. Mom didn't come to help me move into my dorm. Brandon had anxiety about her leaving. But Ben was there, his presence a comforting shield against the emptiness left by her absence. College was my first real taste of freedom. Away from Mom's suffocating favoritism, I began to discover who I was beyond the shadow of being Brandon's forgotten sister. I thrived academically, made new friends, and finally started to believe I was worth something. Ben remained a steady source of support. We had weekly phone calls where he would ask about my classes and plans. Mom, on the other hand, rarely called unless she needed something. "Your brother's going through a rough phase," Ben explained during one of our calls. "I tried to get him involved in sports again, but—" "Let me guess," I interrupted, already knowing the answer. "She said you were being too hard on him." "Exactly." His voice was heavy with exhaustion. "The few times I visited home, I barely saw Brandon. He stayed locked in his room, glued to his video games, while Mom followed him around with endless excuses." At 27, after years of hard work, I finally saved enough for a down payment on my first apartment. It wasn't anything extravagant, a small one-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood, but it was mine. Every penny I'd saved, every small sacrifice I'd made, led to that moment. Excited, I called home to share the news. "You have to come see it. I'm hosting a housewarming party next Saturday. I'll cook dinner. I'll even make your favorite lasagna." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, baby girl," Ben said warmly. But Mom's voice cut in sharp and dismissive. "Oh, honey, I don't think we can go. Brandon has plans that day." "Plans?" I asked, skepticism creeping into my tone. She muttered something vague, but in the background, I could hear the familiar sound of Brandon's video game. 2 years later, I got the call that shattered whatever remained of our fragile family dynamic. Ben had collapsed at work and passed away from a heart attack. He was the only person who had truly been there for me, and now he was gone. At the funeral, Brandon showed up in wrinkled khakis and a polo shirt, staring at his phone throughout the service. Mom made excuses for him, whispering to concerned relatives, "He's processing his grief in his own way." Without Ben's income, Mom quickly found herself in financial trouble. One evening she called, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard before. "Harper, we need your help. Please." Despite everything, I agreed. I set up an automatic transfer of $1,500 to her account every month. But the resentment grew with each passing month as I watched my own dreams take a backseat to their needs. Months passed, and despite my financial support, Mom's calls became increasingly frequent and desperate. Brandon still wasn't working, and every conversation circled back to how difficult things were for them. I tried to keep my distance emotionally, but each call left me drained. One night, after yet another tense phone call, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at my bank account. The automatic transfers had drained a significant portion of my savings. I realized that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. They would always need more, and I would always be expected to provide it. The next day, I called Mom. My voice was steady, though my heart raced. "Mom, I can't keep sending money every month." "What do you mean, Harper? You know how hard things are right now. Brandon needs me, and I know he needs you," I interrupted. "But I can't keep sacrificing my future to support him. I've done my part. It's time you and Brandon figure things out without me." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Mom finally spoke, her voice was cold. "I always knew you didn't care about this family." I didn't respond. I simply hung up, feeling a strange mix of guilt and relief. For the first time in my life, I had set a boundary, and I wasn't going to back down. After cutting off financial support, I expected things to get better, but instead, I was consumed by doubt. Was I selfish for walking away? Had I done enough for them? The questions haunted me, but deep down, I knew I had made the right choice. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work and hobbies. I joined a local writing group, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. Slowly, I began to feel like I was reclaiming my life. One evening, as I was revising a short story for the group, I received a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Harper. It's Brandon. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, the part that still cared, knew that this was an opportunity for something different. I replied, "Sure. Call me." The phone rang almost immediately. Brandon's voice, once familiar but now distant, greeted me. "Hey, I just wanted to say, I get it. You were right to stop helping. I need to figure out my life." I was taken aback. Brandon, who had always been sheltered by Mom, sounded sincere. We talked for over an hour. He admitted that he had started therapy and was looking for a job. For the first time, I felt hope, not just for him, but for myself. Months later, Brandon called again, this time with good news. He had found a job at a local bookstore, and although it didn't pay much, he was proud to be earning his own money. Mom was still struggling to adjust, but she was slowly learning to let go. Our relationship wasn't perfect. There were still lingering tensions and unspoken wounds, but it was better. We had all started to heal in our own ways. One evening, as I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I thought about everything that had happened. The years of neglect, the weight of responsibility, the loss of Ben, and the decision to finally put myself first. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the expectations that had defined my life. Free to dream, to grow, to live for myself. I picked up my journal and began to write, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. This was my story, and for the first time, I was in control of how it ended. A year later, I published my first book, a memoir about family, loss, and finding one's identity. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't need to be. Writing it had been cathartic, a way to close a chapter of my life and open a new one. At the launch event, Brandon showed up with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I'm proud of you, Harper," he said, his voice steady and genuine. "I'm proud of you too," I replied, pulling him into a hug. As we stood there, surrounded by friends and strangers, I realized that the past no longer had power over me. I had faced it, learned from it, and moved forward. And in doing so, I had found something I never thought I would: peace. This was my life now, imperfect, uncertain, but entirely my own. And for the first time, that was enough.